来自海内外的武学界的专家学者及老师们，大家早安！非常开心，各位来参加这一个盛会。那首先呢，我代表大会要特别感谢香港中华武学会的主席赵世庆先生，他们率领的香港及欧洲的专家学者团队们来参加这个盛会。事实上，讲参加应该是不太对的，因为他们也是主办方之一。那特别感谢就是说，赵先生把香港的第5届国际武学研讨会呢，能够移师到台湾这边来主办。这个对台湾来说是一个非常有意义的事情。那在2018年的时候，我到香港参加赵先生所主办的第2届国际武学研讨会，那一次的活动给我非常大的一个震撼。不管是武学的规格跟内容，简直是超出我的想象之外。我不晓得说，武术的活动、武学的活动可以到达这样子一种精致的一种程度。那我自己本人从事武学工作30年，那我在这边可以很肯定的说，赵先生所办的这个武学活动，应该是当今国际武学或者是武术的活动里面，算是最高的一个殿堂。这个话绝对是不是溢美之词啊？绝对是没有错的，它的规格是这个样子的。那这一次呢，我们的整个的主题活动叫“武学新思路：东西武学文献与对话”，就包括1楼的文献展，跟我们今天跟明天的2场国际武学研讨会及国际武学高峰论坛。我自己个人呢，我从事这个武学的工作呢，我把它分为3个阶段。第一个是学习的阶段。当我们还对这个大环境还不是很清楚的时候，我们是处于一种学习的一个阶段。那第2个呢，就是分享。当我们有能力的时候呢，我们就可以分享给我们周遭的一些好朋友，跟整个圈子、跟整个武术圈。那今天我们能够做到的，就是分享。第3个呢，应该是最高的境界。就是成就他人。那今天我们在台湾举办第5届国际武学研讨会呢，我们是处于一种被成就者的一个角色，但是希望未来呢，我们也可以有机会来成就他人，成就整个武术圈。那这个是我今天简短的一个开幕的一个致辞。好，在这边我还是要特别感谢赵世庆先生所带领他们的团队，欧洲的那个专家学者及香港的一些前辈们，这个对我们台湾的武学界来说是一个非常重要的一个新的篇章，也是一个新的开端，也开启了东西武学文献与对话的一个新的一个契机。那下面呢，我们今天的第一场演讲是由马明达教授，他的讲题是正本清源，传承创新。我这里先稍微介绍一下马明达教授。马教授呢是中国著名的历史学家，也是武术家。他是历史系的荣誉退休教授，也是暨南大学博士生的荣誉退休导师，以及中华武学会及中华国术总会的共同创办人。那我跟马老师认识大概也有10多年的一个时间了，那深受他的启发跟教育非常的深。马明达教授呢，他非常重视传统武学文化体系的建构，一生呢致力于武术学及武术文献学的教育工作，是当今华人世界上最重要的推动者之一。 那接下来呢，我们就来聆听马明达教授为我们今天做的第一场演讲，题目是正本清源，传承创新。谢谢。
参加第5届国际武学研讨会的各位女士们、先生们，非常高兴呢，有机会能在这个大会上做一个发言。我也是很仓促的做了点准备吧，简单的谈一谈自己关于武学的一点肤浅的认识，供大家参考。我讲的题目是正本清源，继承创新。以下是我要讲的内容。大家都知道，中华文明是一个非常丰富而庞大的文化体系。按照我们中国的古人他们最初的认识，把这样一个庞大的文化体系呢，大致的分为文武2个方面。文的我就不谈了，我从武的认识上来谈一点。我们中国人把武看作是中华文明的非常重要的一个构成部分，实际上在相当一段时间里，它甚至居于主要位置，它就构成了我们中华民族自古以来的所谓中华民族的尚武精神，以及以尚武精神指导下的各种尚武活动、尚武运动，各式各样的尚武模式。在这个尚武精神中，中国人认为动是核心。一切的尚武都源自于动，其次才是静。动是主体，是核心；静是辅助，是服从。这就是大家都熟悉的中国人所谓古典的5经也罢、6经也罢的6经之首《易经》里最早提出来的。大家都知道，《易经》的第一卦是乾卦，乾卦就是天卦。天卦的象辞就是对这个乾卦的解释的这个词语，我们的古人说得很清楚。这个象辞就是大家都熟悉的自强不息、厚德载物。而这个自强不息应该怎么解释呢？现在的解释很多，有一些解释实际上不太符合中国最古的这些经典注释家们的理性认识。我们现在保留下来的《易经》的最早的注解本是三国的曹魏时期的王弼。王弼说得很分明，天那就是谦，谦这个字音和天这个字音很相近，天就是谦，谦就是天。行就是动，行就是运动。这是运动这个词在中国的第一次出现，请大家注意，它是在曹魏时期，也就是东汉末年曹魏占有中原最大地盘时候的一位著名的经学家王弼，他提出来，所谓行者运动也。然后就是健，他认为因为天它是运动的，所以天表现出来的状态是强健的、健壮的，而不是我们一般所理解的所谓健康的身体状态良好就是健，不是。 比一般的良好状态要更高一个层级，强健、强壮。而这一切都归因于什么？归因于动。因为有了动这个主体，于是乎才附身了静作为动的一个辅助部分。静是服从于动的，是一个调节手段，是一个补充手段。于是乎就形成了中国人所谓身体运动的动静观，构成了我们尚武精神里面的2大元素。而前者表现为刚，后者表现为柔，这也就是无极而生太极，太极而生阴阳。阴阳的出动点是什么？是动。因为有了一动这么一个触动的结果，这样一个本来什么也没有的太极就转换为了阴静阳动图。这就是我们现在到处都能看到的那个所谓太极图，那不叫太极图，那叫阴静阳动图。于是就有了四象，就有了八卦，就有了万物，就有了世界上的一切现象。而这个现象的核心起源来自于一个动字。这是中华民族我们这样一个伟大的文明系统中最重要的一个字，它也构成了伟大的中华民族能够发展为一个世界上最丰富、最源远流长的文化体系的一个重要原因。但是后来有一些变化，那么这个变化，一方面是一部分人继续坚持着以动为核心的世界观，或者说叫天道观，缩小一点可以把它缩小到人生观上，我们也可以把它叫做生命观。我们的生命就在于动。后来受其他文化的影响，我们又开始夸大地认识了静，把静由一个辅助的调节的手段看作是一个主体手段，认为只要我们静下来，少动一点，我们的生命就会越发的延长，我们的身体就会显得更加的好。这个所谓身体更加的好，或者我们的生命状态更加的绵延的核心就是求长寿。这里面就有了一个重要的区别，前者是强调生命的质量，不仅是要长寿，而且要拥有最佳的状态和质量，而后者是不以质量为核心的长寿。活了120岁、130岁、150岁，甚至我们开始不是崇拜那个真正的动向的一些物体、一些天象，而我们开始崇拜一些静止的、不动的，但它寿命又很绵延、寿命又很长的一些物体。这个不奇怪，即使是这样，我们依然始终坚守着以动为核心的这样的天道观。正是在这个天道观的推动下，我们中华民族的文化拥有了一些优势。这个优势的第一条就是我前面讲了，生生不息，它在动，在动中提升自己的品德水平，做到厚德载物，那也就是一种宽容精神，一种人道的、宽容的，更多对同类关注和关心的心理。那么这是第一，中华民族是富有人道主义精神的民族。人道主义精神是中华民族文明中最重要的文化现象。第二， 我们动的目的之一就是要交流，甚至可以这样讲，我们的很多动，我们这是不是被动，而是主动去寻求更丰富的文化资源，我们以达到交流，这就有了大家都所熟知的汉唐气象。汉唐气象的核心就是交流，就是开放。大家都知道，汉武帝不只是被动的防备匈奴，而是主动的出击。一方面在战斗，一方面在和亲，一方面派出使者去交流，是在匈奴的后边去寻求盟友，取得新的文化知识，找到新的更高技术含量的武艺手段以及其他文化手段，这就有了堂皇的汉朝气象。大唐也是如此，他们本身就是一个多元民族构成的文化因为我们拥有这样的非常先进的、非常可以说得之于天的这样一个优势，我们领域辽阔，我们又是多民族构成，我们的周边又有很多不同的文化，这就给我们的交流带来了非常方便、非常便利的这样的渠道，这样取之不尽的资源。那么有了这种交流，就使得中华文明，当希腊罗马文明发展的非常高、非常发达，希腊罗马的哲学思维以及它的科学技术水平都高度发展的时候，我们和希腊罗马之间就有沟通，就有来往。后来阿拉伯帝国崛起以后，我们仍然和阿拉伯帝国之间既有冲突，也有交流，甚至有更大规模的贸易往来。所以交流就成为我们中华文明生生不息的一个充满了活力的这样一个文明体系的一个重要原因。第三，就是我们一方面守住我们的本，守住中华文明的根本，就是这个动的根本；一方面我们在不断的加大交流，但同时我们在守正守本的基础上不断创新，不断探索新的理解。以我刚才讲到的我们的武文化而言，可以说从古至今从来也没有停止过变化。变化就是创新，变化就是在不同的时间、空间条件下，我们主动的做出各式各样的学习。大家都很熟悉的赵武灵王以虎符骑射。到了汉代，我们终于从车战的状态转化为骑兵作战和步兵作战的联合模式。我们的兵器发生了一个重大的变化，以先秦的戈、戟、矛等多种形式开始发展到隋唐的以矛为主，以马上的打击兵器为辅，以及我们对马的驾驭的能力。对马的所有的设备、马的配置，好多东西都是我们在交流中学来的。中国人是主张学习的，学习才是最大的智慧。那么因为有了这么三条，特别是最后这一条，我们一方面守住我们自己的文化传统，一方面也不断的在学习中去创新，开创新的局面。于是我们的武文化在相当长的历史时期里， 尽管我们遭遇过这样那样的一些军事上的挫折呀，甚至出现过这样那样的本民族内部的权力的交换呢，但我们没有灭亡过。我们没有灭亡过，一直到第二次世界大战，当我们一个单独的中国在抗拒着东亚最强大的日本侵略者的时候，我们在一段时间里是孤立的。有些国家只是暗中秘密的帮助我们而已，比如美国。有些国家甚至和日本签订了和平的条约，承认伪满洲国，承认日本对我们外蒙古的占领。我们在非常艰难的情况下，日本人并没有能够灭亡我们，而在最后我们获得了胜利。至于历史上出现的这个民族或者那个民族在中原政权中进行这样那样的交替，那是我们中华民族自身的政权变化而已。因为我们的文化没有灭亡，不管是任何一个我们的周边的少数民族入主中原以后，他仍然得坚守中华民族的文化，特别是中华民族的尚武文化。我们在文武两套文化系统中，武文化、文武这两个方面，他都要给予足够的重视。那么所以我们的文化曾经在相当长的历史时期里保持着世界上最辉煌的一个存在。有了一些变化，这些变化也不奇怪，因为我们在长期一种缓慢的几乎进入循环状态的这样一个王朝更迭中，外来的某一些东西开始影响到我们的思想，特别是宗教，比如佛教的进入，是中华民族历史上最大规模的外来思想文化的进入。在佛教以外，还没有另外一个是任何宗教或者任何其他文化思维形式像佛教对中国影响这么之大。在一个长时间的社会相对发展缓慢，农耕文明的模式没有向更高层位的生产模式发展，于是一部分人就开始在动静位置的排列上，在思维上出现了变化，开始强调静，认为静比动更重要。这就是所谓宋代理学的主导位置，以周敦颐的太极图说为代表，以及所谓当时号称道家，实际上接受了很多佛学禅宗东西的一部分人，开始强调静，它对我们的武文化产生了某种程度的削弱。我们的文明中，我们自先秦以动为主的这样一个文化体系开始出现了动静并列，不是以动为主，以静为辅，而是动静并列，甚至个别人强调以静为主了。严格的讲，这是一种文化偏移。我们的先辈们，我们的明清，特别是明末清初的一大批学者，曾经有过非常沉痛的反思，对这个问题进行了深刻的，甚至至今我们读了以后都会为之伤感的这样一些反思。我们忽略了动和我们的身体，和我们的生命，和我们国家整个的活力的重要关联。当然，问题还在于宋元理学继续向明清延续。明清延续是我们在坦诚地承认，我们在整个全世界都开始向 近现代的工业化社会转型的过程中，我们的某些王朝，比如明朝，比如清朝，处于某种保守状态。他们不再具有我们的先辈们的那样一些主动的交流与学习的精神。以康熙本人而言，他自己积极的学习，他的身边有过南怀仁有过汤若望等等这样一系列的西方所谓传教士，他们带来了大量新的科学理念。康熙本人也很感兴趣，但是他没有把它放到治国理政之道中，没有变成社会的公共财富。那么以我们的武而言，火器出现了，火器出现了是一次重大的革命啊！传统的刀兵武艺、骑射武艺，在火器的面前一下子黯然失色。这个不是我们国家，是整个世界都发生了这样的变化。相对于我们而言，欧洲人就很快的把所谓中世纪传统的刀兵武艺开始向体育的竞技模式转型。他们走先了，他们看到了这种体育竞技模式本身对于社会、对于文化发展的重要意义。比如教育人民具有规则思想，比如教育人民通过体育锻炼来强健身体，比如教育人民通过强烈的甚至激烈的竞技来增加我们的胆识，提升我们的勇敢度。而我们没有，我们在这些方面明显的有点落后，甚至有点瞧不起好动的人。认为君子最大的特点是要静下来，只有安静的静下来读书，通过国家的所谓科举制度来求取功名，才是人生之正道。那么至于你放下书来不读，你一天顽强舞棒练习走马射箭，就会被人看作是一个不肖子弟，是一个不努力的年轻人。社会上出现了对动的歧视社会风气发生了变化。但即使是这样，我们也不落后，我们也没有完全落后下来，因为我们的先贤们很早就注意到这些东西还是要向外学习。我们很早就有人从我们周边的国家，比如从日本，日本在完成明治维新改革以后，大面积的引进西方体育史来改变日本传统的体育模式时，这些东西对中国的启发是很大的。我们大批量的人去从日本学习，然后把西方的体育这个理念引进来，而且巧妙地使用了我们中华民族早在1000多年以前就有的运动这个词，使它再生光芒，使很多人都处于运动状态。所以体育的普及大概是西方文明进入中国的一切文明里传播速度最快、最受老百姓欢迎的，因为我们缺失，我们严重缺失。就相当于我们身体的缺钙，你严重缺钙时，身体吸收钙的能力将会很强。于是就有了创新，又有了在这个基础上如何把我们传统的尚武精神、我们自己的运动模式、我们古代留下来的各式各样的运动方式，不管是官方的，不管是民间的，我大略的统计一下，至少超过几十项，在我们这样一个伟大的广袤的中华民族的领土上，存在着各式各样的民间的体育活动，开始把它整合，开始把它分类，开始试图来创建我们中华民族自己的体育体系。 这方面我们的先辈还是做了努力的，我们不能完全不了解我们不能完全不了解，应该去了解，应该去认知，知道我们的先辈做了努力。这个努力的目的就是为了创新，不是照搬。我们没有办法照搬古代的那一套，因为古代的生活环境这个社会制度，特别是法律制度，和现代有巨大的不同，我们无法照搬，我们只能按照现代社会的模式现在的时空条件下，怎么样来创新性适应。我们的先辈做过这种努力，包括短短的民国的北洋时期，只有15年左右的北洋政府时期，就做了试验我想大家也都注意到了，我们最近对北洋政府时期我们国家的发展状态开始有了相对公正的评价，不像过去一笔抹杀军阀混战，天下大乱，忽略了北洋时期是曾经我们国家的经济发展速度最快的一个历史时期，因为它的平均经济发展速度已经达到了10%以上，最高达到12%左右。那还是我们的先贤在努力我们大批量的优秀的人才都是在那个时期产生的，包括我们体育界的人才包括董守义先生，包括袁东礼先生包括孔祥熙先生，包括张伯苓先生，他们都做了大量的努力的所以今天的会我就只能给大家简单的来讲一下我的理解。我觉得我们面对着目前这样一个世界多变，而且世界形势非常复杂的状态下，就我们中华民族而言，在体育或者说在我们中华民族自身的武文化这个体系里，我们应该怎么办？我觉得要努力的正本清源，认清楚我们中华民族自身的体育价值是怎么发展的，我们几千年来的我们的尚武精神的主流是什么？我觉得很多人是不大了解的，因为他们被很多相对庸俗的、相对低层次的所谓的文化宣传所迷蒙了因为我们的很多年轻人接触到的不是真正的历史，而是民国时才大规模兴起的武侠小说和民国后才兴起的大量的所谓的武打片，以及这些所谓的武打片、武侠小说的作家们他们在编故事，他们所讲的很多内容和历史事实毫无关联，是他做梦出来的。我们的历史不是那样的我们从这个圈里走不出来，于是我们自己的武术也走了一个非常曲折的道路，尽管时间不长，一共几十年的时间里，我们得承认我们走了很委婉的、很曲折的道路我们有过国术的试验，但是后来被完全废弃了我们又开始编造新的所谓武术，叫竞技武术居然公开的把高难新美作为标准，那就是把中华民族自古以来以尚武精神为核心的武文化变成舞蹈的舞，变成舞蹈文化，以弥补汉民族的舞蹈缺失，而不是回归到我们中华民族自身早就有的尚武精神与尚武运动模式上来幸好有了改革开放，改革开放使得我们有了时间来重新反思这些问题，重新认识这些问题那么至少各式各样的不同的武术表现形式你都存在不要提倡一个打倒一个不要官方的极少数人不代表政治体制，不代表领导的最高层位的思想 而只代表他个人的狭隘的观点和有限的学问，来编造出来一套东西，然后在全国推行、全国推广，造成了严重的后果。但即使是这些东西，它既要有利于人们的身体健康，仍然让它存在。但是，我们作为一个学术研究者，作为武学研究者，要有更深度的认识，要正本清源，要回归到我们中华民族文化的主脉上来，回归到我们中华民族几千年来曾经昌盛的中华民族的运动文化上来。我们有我们的晋级模式，我们可以向西方学习他们的晋级体制，但是我们完全不必照猫画虎，我们完全不必一定按照他那样一个形式走，我们可以创建我们的晋级系统。这也是我们中华民族对世界文化的一个贡献。我们中国人很骄傲，这种骄傲是自身以来就有的。为什么？因为我们有中华文明，我们在中华文明的巨大的这样一个体系内，我们又有着极其丰富的文化，包括武文化，用通俗的话说，包括体育文化。所以我们不应该仅仅用一种模式来衡量我们的运动员到底强不强。我们为了争这样那样一块金牌，全国人都为之在那里把一切希望或者失望都捆绑在人家所设定的某一个模式上。我们这个超过17亿人口的大国，难道没有自己的模式？难道在顾拜旦以外没有中国人自己能够另外设定的一种竞赛模式、竞技模式？那么如果连这个都没有的话，那我们几千年来我们的所谓汉唐气象，我们的宋元气象，那它靠啥的？请大家读读书吧，多读点书，了解一下我们的古人们是怎么样享受我们自己的体育文化的。我们如何在我们自己的武文化的这个公共长江与黄河之中享受着那种乐趣的？我很想念这种乐趣因为时间的原因，我大概就讲这么多。因为临时做的准备，也没有很周密的思考，只是把自己的一点想法有一部分内容呢，也和这个我的儿子吧，马连真教授做过交流我们一起在对这些问题进行过讨论，所以我的发言在一定程度上也代表他代表这个马连真教授和有不对的地方请大家批评指正。我非常真诚地祝愿我们这一次学术讨论会圆满成功。
Is the master. The title of my presentation is slightly provoking by design. It challenges one of the core features of European martial arts in the 21st century. During this presentation, I will paint for you my observations of the modern-day practice of what is labeled in our 21st century globalized world as historical European martial arts. I will do it from different perspectives. As a researcher, having spent now 20 years looking into primary sources as an historian of martial arts, as a practitioner, as a teacher of these reconstructed arts, and as an institutional actor for the communities of practitioners, especially with regards to my roles in sport federation, well, attempting sport federation. Does this work now? Yes. Let's start with a simple definition. I quote, "Martial arts are bodily practices transmitted from body to body between practitioners. They may be labeled or identified as styles or tradition in a specific cultural context, or in a globalized world that is institutionalization, pop culture." If, end of quote, if we accept this concept, then what are the European martial arts, and in which context are they performed in history? Let me take you through successful pop culture images from recent shows or movies to enter in those primary sources. Let's start with Bak Mei. Doesn't work. Yes. So the martial arts is embodied by the figure of the old priest hidden in a remote monastery like Bak Mei in the Hollywood movie Kill Bill from 2004. It symbolizes a hidden knowledge which is hardly accessible, only by special training and the status of a disciple by a master which is the living recipient of a tradition. According to European primary sources, this image does not exist. It is far away from monasteries or religion. In this example, which is the first European fight book dating 1305, the master is a priest. You can see this with the two characters on the right. They wear a robe of a priest and they are tonsured, that is their haircut, which are the identifiers for ordained priests. However, they do not represent fighting monks, but clerics in an urban context. Clerics are the teachers and the students at European universities from the 13th to the 15th century. University students are taking martial arts lessons for many reasons, back then and today the same, but these are not in the curriculum of their studies. Back then was not, today still not. Now, if we look into Sir Lawrence Tyrrell, so the martial arts are embodied by the warriors, usually, which are the entitled to practice and are displaying martial skills in public, that are the knights in armor for the medieval European history. Like Lawrence Tyrrell, the Knight of the Flowers in the TV series Game of Thrones, here at the tournament. This stereotypical figure is part of the primary sources, the European fight books. Here you can see two armored practitioners fighting on foot with the knightly weapons used in tournaments, that are the lances in the hand of the left fighter, the small tournament shields lying on the ground, and the swords. This type of combat sport, the tournament, is rarely addressed in the corpus of fight books. This fighting in armor is, but usually in the context of more serious matter, such as judicial duel. The martial arts are often depicted as being transmitted face to face with an expert and a student, using blunt weapons, training weapons, like Sirio Forel, a master at arms teaching a princess in the same TV series, Game of Thrones. Here you see a printed fight book with illustration of two men in civilian clothing, no armor, no protection, fencing with a longsword, which is a knightly weapon. This is more typical context of fighting, which is found in almost every European fight books. Now, if we move to two contexts, this is a very important slide for me. The martial arts are often considered as being designed to be practiced in two opposite contexts. The warfare with the unique warriors or the theater play with the king and the queen of the same TV series, Game of Thrones. Actually, it's part of the same martial principle expressed in two different contexts, not necessarily opposed. I consider them as two sides of the same coin. Here you'll see two representations of the 15th century in a decorated Italian manuscript representing the children of the gods. Here Mars on the left, god of war, and the sun, the god of courtly arts. The sons are performing martial gestures with weapon, but not with the same intent or the same context. So this section was intended to touch upon the different contexts for martial practice without being exhaustive, putting them into relation to stereotypes attached to European martial arts distributed by pop culture today. I would like to invite you to delve to a more look into these primary sources. What are these fight books? On the left, you can see a map of Europe with the towns where the fight books were printed. The bigger the circle, the bigger the number of different books. The bigger circles are the cities, without surprises, the centers where the printing industry was the most active. This is notably Venice, Paris, Madrid, London, and Frankfurt. You'll note that all European languages are represented on this map with books about fighting. And there are different types of books. On the right-hand side, you can see manuscripts and prints. And a remarkable number of this corpus, over 300 books, if we look from the 15th to the early 17th century. This is a remarkable number, which will increase in the following centuries. Now, how we interpret them. Practitioners and researchers tend to analyze these primary sources according to modern Asian martial arts model, in the idea. This is intended as a criticism, but it's also a reality, since any system of value must be referenced toward experience, especially when we are dealing with embodied knowledge. What matters for the researchers or the expert practitioners is to be able to deconstruct these comparative approaches. And let me take you into a panorama of these different types of sources at our disposal and their specificities regarding the type and categories. Real men read poetry. The first is the use of the verses in the written versions of the description of embodied knowledge. This phenomenon is known to any form of technical knowledge transmission. That is called transliteration. The action is pretty simple. It's to go from speech to word in order for mnemonic purposes using verses. The concept is very straightforward. If a group of several people are practicing together the same type of gestures, they will put words on them to express their meaning according to their own cultural settings. This can be referred as style. It then becomes martial arts as soon as enough people are practicing a similar set of gestures using the same word to describe them, to teach, or to refer to it. It is natural to find versified teaching in the corpus of European fight books. On the left, you'll find an example using both verses to illustrate a principle, followed by a prose description referring to a technical illustration. This is the most complete setup. The setup is common to a large number of late medieval fight books. On the right, you can see a more obscure transliteration. It's a series of verse, couplets actually, which names scenarios with the master displaying a specific fighting stance with its facing stance taken by the disciple. Here, no illustration and no prose description. The first example can be interpreted, the second less so, because there is not enough information to make a proper analysis. Anything can be hidden behind these technical words used to depict stances. Visual mantras. Another way to include complex ideas in an abbreviated form for teaching or is for mnemonic purposes is to create a visual representation referring to widespread concept. This type of association with visual representations is common when describing complex concepts such as martial virtues or in the naming of specific martial techniques. Here you can see a late medieval segno common in the Italian corpus, which is an embodiment of martial skills. The central character is used to map them according to space. You can see a caliper, a bear, a serpent, a hound, a sun, a castle, and keys. The accompanying text are verses, again, couplets, transliteration, easy to learn by heart and to remember. The animal skills are the mechanical features of an object, and what they represent for the cultural settings they belong to is associated with human gestures. This type of didactic technical element is common to other arts or activities, such as the use of metaphors in religious performance, as simple as preaching, for example. Kadas or taolus. Another typical form of transmission is the martial art forms. That is the repetition of a specific set of motion in series, usually performed solo. As you know, the idea here is to perform regularly pre-established gestures in an imaginary scenario in order to acquire muscle memory to embody martial principles. This method also appears in the fight books, but is not the most common feature. Here you can watch a part of a 10th form of the longsword assalto after the master Machile Marozzo, first printed in 1536. The form has been captured in 2018 in Hong Kong by the Italian martial expert Wei Hing Chao. The gestures are reconstructed based on the interpretation of the primary sources. Cinemascope. Almost half of the remaining fight books are illustrated. The illustration does not always achieve the same didactic purpose or is not used in the same manner by all authors. The main issue with analyzing an image, which is still and frozen on paper, is that it represents an instant on a 2D flat page when actually refers to one movement in a complex series of gestures in a 3D environment. This issue is called parataxis, and some authors, very early in history, have tried to overcome this limit of visual representation by decomposing the movement with visual superimposition on the left. This process is known to us by video, which was invented after photography. The first photograph using this method is Edward Muybridge, you can see this on the top right, in the last quarter of the 19th century, but the source I refer to is mid-16th century. On the left you can see two illustrations of Camillo Agrippa, which was a mathematician and an architect in the middle of the 16th century Roma. In his fight books, he used mathematics and geometry to describe human motion. This was a revolution in the science of the description of motion. But analyzing an image without its related original text is a bias. Understanding the relationship between the image and the text is key to decipher the martial knowledge in its written form. Sometimes even primary sources are biased. On the right, you can see a re-edition of the same treatise where the printer decided to reorganize the order of the figures to win money when printing the fight books. And actually, the result is a biased version of the original teaching. It is wrong. If you read and interpret this one, you have a biased interpretation. You have to understand the history behind these books. Lastly, hyperrealism. Yes. The martial experts went very far in their attempt to overcome the limits of the page, both their use of image and text. The results can be seen as hyperrealism. On the right, you can see a text from an Italian martial expert, Giovanni della Gacocchie, who wrote his treatise in the use of the civilian sword. He developed a complex technical vocabulary based on previous authors, but with his own additions and reorganization of pre-existing material. Without a dictionary or some reference in the description of this technical concept, the interpretation of the teaching is pretty challenging. And the author chose not to include illustration on purpose. On the right, you can see an illustrated manuscript, also by an Italian master, offered as a diplomatic gift to the King of France. The author argues that the use of low-quality printed image is not appropriate to describe the art of fencing. This is obvious and open criticism to a printed book by a French author who received royal privilege. This is competition between two masters. The arguments of the Italian masters include that the detailed illustration painted by skillful painters is absolutely essential to convey martial arts knowledge, which is the opposite argument in the previous one. All right, so we've seen different contexts, different type of sources that we have, but one that is more common to most of the fight book is competition. Every martial arts, from the beginning on, experts or practitioners who participated in writing a fight book did not always choose the same methods nor pursued the same goals. That is why the corpus of the European fight books is so different. In there you have mass-produced printed books, unique manuscripts dedicated to princes, manuscript notes compiled with copies of other content, personal manuscript of martial experts or students, and so on. If there is one topic standing out of this heterogeneous corpus, it is the competitive practice. A large majority of the fight books between the 14th and the early 17th century does explicitly mention competitive practices. May they be used to train, display martial skills, or perform social rituals. Several, if not the majority, of the authors are associated with social groups that are associations of martial experts. These groups are usually able to distribute the title of Master at Arms, and they left significant traces in urban context in the European cities of the 15th to the 17th century. Let's have a look here at one example. This is an archive document describing the practice of a fencing lesson in order to prepare citizens and all comers for competition with a longsword, fought without protection in the city of Solothurn in 1546. This document was produced by the town secretary, documenting a permit given to the master to hold the lesson in the walls of the town. We know how much he charged for the lesson, what were the rules, even the technical content is named. The master was a native of Solothurn and a craftsman of the Pelt Guild. He was a pelt maker. His business with the martial arts was his side business, approved by a fencing guild, which ruled over a regional network of cities. It somehow looked like that. Let's look closer at that image, which gives you a visual representation of such competition in the early 16th century. This is a small woodcut engraving meant to decorate the top margin of a page, actually 4 by 12 centimeters. The artist is Virgil Solis, and the work is dated of 1541. You can see a pair of competitors equipped with different weapons. From the left to the right, you can see staff, pikes, dusaks, which are short one-handed weapons with curved blades, and longsword. All of these weapons are represented in the fight books of the time, which also reflects what was used by soldiers on the battlefield. As I said, it's not only the only context documented where martial arts were practiced, but that is one where we have a very large body of primary sources, including technical, administrative, and narrative ones. So how do we go from this history, which is documented but not enough research, into modern practice? So it's labeled European martial arts, historical European martial arts. It's not accepted by the practitioners themselves as a revival or as ancient. So a revival of ancient traditions that is distant in time or which was interrupted in time. A lot of practitioners nowadays are defining themselves with the label Historical European Martial Arts, short as HEMA, which stands for, as you know, the title. But actually it was not an invention, it's based on a reinvention. If we go to the 19th century, it happened before. Actually, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, it saw the birth of modern sports and the Olympic Games going towards globalization. At the same time, fencers collectors and martial experts draw attention to the marvels of the European martial heritage through a reconstruction of old traditional martial arts based on the study of fight books. Again, the same. You can see here Egerton Castle, which made quite some noise about his expertise. He often lectured at universities and public places, organizing both prize fights and demonstrations. Look how close the aesthetics of the late 19th century is with the early 21st century practice today. It's the same for those who have already seen modern HEMA. Egerton Castle left us with several books of his own, both regarding the history and of the martial arts and his technical interpretation of them. Castle is one of the many examples we can find in Europe at that time. This phenomenon was alive and flourishing for over 30 years, and then decreased to vanish with the world wars. In a second wave of revival started with a pocket of interest of action in the 1990s in Europe and in the US. The community grew and unprecedented access was given to the primary sources via internet. Some initiative arose in institutions, mostly universities and museums. In the 2000s, the first international events started and the label HEMA came into being. So it's 25 years old, but it's much more older. In the 2010, an international federation was created, but mostly connected about only 10 European federations, so not really international. In 2015, the spread of the practice could be spotted on at least 4 continents and became globalized, but still rather small in terms of numbers of practitioners. In 2020, I published with 2 European colleagues a small report on the development of the modern-day historical European martial arts for the International Center of Martial Arts for Youth Development and Engagement based in South Korea. I can give access to this document if anyone is interested, and I would like to quote the identity. I quote, "The core element of HEMA's identity is its relationship to a written corpus concerning variety of martial traditions, which are supposedly extinct. The written accounts of European martial arts used as main primary sources for HEMA communities are the fight books, a subgenre of technical literature appearing from the late Middle Ages onwards. These primary sources cover a variety of martial arts disciplines, ranging from wrestling to armed combat with different weapons, with or without armor, on foot or on horseback. Knowledge about these martial arts is usually transmitted orally in a face-to-face, body-to-body situation by demonstration, imitation, and correction. Written media is therefore limited when it comes to actually transmitting martial embodied knowledge and may have served different purposes in their original production or context, that is the promotion, the memorial devices, personal notes, and so on. Therefore, they are not to be considered manuals in the modern sense of the term." End of quote. What and whys here on your right. In summary, you can see some of the key questions we addressed in this report. About the what, I believe the first 3, that is combat sports, cultural activities, and scientific activities, are rather clear. But there are areas in which the HEMA practitioners can be contextualized. It's not all. My colleague Audrey, which is a sociologist, added this 4th category, alternative leisure activity. That represents not mainstream practice, but which are similar enough to constitute a phenomena for an outside perspective. This is what we do as European martial artists. We don't have sport federation, we don't have Olympic medals, we don't have goals. We are promoting self-diversity and we are inventing ways to go forward. This list is applicable to all martial practices. And regarding the whys, the reason behind the HEMA practices, so preparation for violent conflict, play and competitive sports, performance, transcendent goals, and healthcare. These categories comes from a research published by my colleague Six Wetzler, and it applies to all martial traditions. In our report, we commented under each of these bullet points, and I don't have the time now here to go in details. You can see on the top left the visual identity of this international federation, which I mentioned before. As I said, it never really managed to cross the European borders, mainly because it was designed to gather functioning national federations. This is the case for several countries in Europe. It's not the case in the US, where there are a large number of practitioners but no governing bodies. It is the same case, according to my knowledge, for Asia and Australia. I was a founding member of this organization and chairman for 5 years, between 2013 and 2018, but I stopped looking into this because we didn't manage to get enough achievement and attention. I was willing to comment on those two small diagrams, but I will not go there. My time is over. I would like to point one issue. It's the disciplines. So on the small side, which you don't see here at the screen, and I cannot shift it, it's presenting the disciplines of historical European martial arts according to the respondent of a survey that we did in 2019. The longsword practice comes first as identity label or figure. It's also the most common weapon dealt with in the 15th and first half of the 16th century source material. But you can see more recent weapons, such as small sword and the saber, which are occurring in the fight books of the 18th and 19th century. You can also see bayonet fighting, which is codified in the First and Second World War. The two latter, you can also see on the other end of the spectrum, the gladiatorial figure and the Viking ones, which don't have any fight book related to this. So everyone, or practitioners of European martial arts, are reviving history, but not according to the same method. When does HEMA start, and when does it end? As an institution, if we want to make a federation with disciplines and disciplines, how do we organize this? When does it start, and when does it end? It's a really difficult question, and actually I would have rather different answers depending on which hat I'm wearing. The historian will answer differently than the martial arts federation chairman, and the practitioner has his own ideas as well. In conclusion, the question was, when does HEMA start and when does it end? I have a rather simple answer, which connects all sections of my talk. As I have mentioned, the HEMA identity is connected strongly to the corpus of fight books, which I presented in the second section of my talk. This misconception is that in Europe, the art of swordsmanship was tarnished by the Industrial Revolution and became useless during the World Wars, exactly what Professor Mingda just said. It therefore completely vanished, but then the transmission of old arts was interrupted. With the rediscovery of the fight books, this art could be revived, reconstructed. You can see the reason maybe now behind my title, The Book is the Master. Most of the Westerners are happy with the widespread misconception that martial arts are from Asia because they are transmitted orally, in some cases uninterruptedly, since the dawn of time. This is the Western representation. But there are no old books in Asia. This is also a misrepresentation. In Europe, the perspective is reversed. We have books, but we have no masters. Therefore, for the Westerners, the book is the master. As you can imagine, it's not the case. It's a strong claim. My answer when it comes, when does it start and when does it end? If we agree that European martial arts are associated with the corpus of the fight books, then it starts in 1305, which is the date of the first preserved fight book. So late Middle Ages. But onward until when? I'm a medievalist, so I would love to see the world end at the end of the Middle Ages. It does not. It does not. It continues and changes up until when? There are fight books produced during the entire Renaissance. Did it stop at the Industrial Revolution? No. Did it stop after the World Wars? Also no. It dramatically changed, yes, but it did not stop, no. Yes, it's a simulated, does it compare to HEMA practice nowadays if we look at sport fencing? Yes and no. Yes, it is a simulated bout with heavy rules and equipment to ensure safety. like they did in the 15th century, but with different choices and less equipment. And no, it does not look similar because the rule set and the equipment with electric contact, priority rules, and linear terrain. Does HEMA competitive sports look the same? I would say yes and no. I'll be happy to discuss this further with you or show you images. I thank you very much for your attention and I look forward to your feedback. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, firstly, good morning, and it is a great pleasure for me to come to Taipei today, and I should like to thank the organizers for organizing this event and for giving me this opportunity to come and speak. Now, I have something to apologize for. I will have to wear a cap because I have some cataract, and if I see these lights here, I can't see anything else. I can't see you. So I have to do this. So I do apologize. I apologize to the people trying to take a video, but I do need to see. I'm really grateful and I appreciate very much the two speeches before mine. Professor Ma Mingda and Professor Daniel Jacquet, because they provide an excellent context for what I have to say. Particularly, as I speak this morning, I would like you to keep in mind Professor Ma's explanation of the history of the concepts of moving and still, dong, jing, as well as the distinction between military and civil, wen wu, because these are key elements when we come to look at the history of teaching archery in more recent times in China. Also, Daniel Jacquet's comments about the use of various media for teaching, plain text, verse, illustration, and moving illustration are also correspond very closely to the things that I'm going to say. So please accept all of those very important speeches as a background to what I have to say. Am I supposed to move the slides myself? Yes, good. Can you hear me clearly? Is the Chinese translation coming through clearly? Okay, thank you. Today, I want to go quite quickly over a few points. Firstly, the phenomenon of materials on archery in China, mainly looking at the instructional materials. Then the question, who read these books? Then the question, who wrote these books? Then the question of what did the books contain? Then I'd like to make a little side journey into the question of books which have been lost and books which are then found, and then a short conclusion. A very brief historical background. Even in some writings from more than 3,000 years ago in China's Shang dynasty, there are oracle bones which mention archery and decisions about archery. Everything in the oracle bones refers to the royal family, not to ordinary people or students. But there are questions such as, when we go hunting, shall we use a fast bow or a slow bow? Now, I don't think I or anybody else understands what that means. But it does mean that there were some discussions on technique that have been recorded very early. And particularly interesting is that the setting for the discussion was a ritual procession around a lake called Pan, which was near the capital of the Shang dynasty, now called Yinxu. And there are echoes of that activity in later periods. But when we get to the Western Zhou period, which followed the Shang, so from about 1000 BCE through and then going to the Eastern Zhou up till about 221 BCE, when we look at that long period, we find the development of a form of archery which influenced the whole of the practice of archery in a certain context throughout history, almost until the 1900s. It is said in a work attributed to Confucius that in early times, in the Western Zhou dynasty, the king used a test of archery to select officials. And there are many texts preserved until today which try to explain that phenomenon. One thing that comes through is, if we bear in mind what Professor Ma taught us about Dong and Jing, about moving and quiet, and the idea that Confucius tended to urge towards the quiet. At the same time, he recognized the movement. As Confucius urged us towards literary, he also recognized the need for military. Indeed, Confucius himself had led a military brigade at one time. And he said something which was very influential. He said, those people who are, let us call them the quiet, the Jing people, who he called Junzi, the educated man, should not struggle against each other. But if they have to, it should be with archery. Because in archery, we practice ritual. And after the practice of archery, we sit down together and we drink wine. And this is one of the leading thoughts that led people to develop archery in a certain way for a certain purpose. In another work, which is attributed to Confucius, but actually was probably finally composed much later, in another work, he talks about a ritual of archery to be used by the king to select good officials. And he was promoting a sort of balance. That is that on the one hand, you have the archer. The bow and the archer were said in the Book of Changes, in the Yi Jing, to possess the weapon which could dominate the world. 皇帝十位公胡使，以威天下. That was in the Yi Xi Ci, in the appendix to the Book of Changes, the Yi Jing. It was strongly believed that the bow and arrow were among the strongest weapons because of their reach in distance and how lethal they could be. but it had to be controlled. This dung could not be excessive. It had to be held back. I shall quote just from this classic, I shall quote in English. Sorry, as soon as I pressed this, the quote went away, but I shall find it again. This is what it said. I'm quoting now in English. The archers met the criteria of the rituals in entering, leaving, or making turning movements in any direction. When their minds were composed and their postures straight, they grasped the bow and arrow, concentrated, and firmed their stance. Only when the archers grasped the bow and arrow, concentrated, and firmed their stance was it possible to talk of meeting the requirements of the rituals. This was a means of assessing their virtuous conduct. This is what the examiners, according to Confucius, were looking for in ancient times. Further in the same text, it says, archery is another way of saying unfurling or releasing. Here he's using a pun, using the old pronunciation of Chinese. So, with an untroubled mind and steady posture, they grasped the bow, concentrated, and firmed their stance. Grasping the bow, concentrating and firming their stance, their shot would just thus hit the target. Throughout these texts, there's a play on words. There's a character in Chinese, zhong, which means in the center. It could also mean the center of the target. But there's another way to pronounce the character, zhong, which means to hit the target. Zhong can be equated with zhongyong, the doctrine of the mean, trying to maintain a center position, not an extreme to the left, not an extreme to the right. And this idea of not too much to the left, not too much to the right, applied to hitting the target and also to the way that the archer stands, this symbol was built in to a certain form of archery which was developed later. Let me go on to that form of archery. In the Tang dynasty, in the 8th century, that is, in around 702 of our era, the then Empress of China, Wu Zetian, instituted forms of fair competition for high-ranking officials. And from an early time, that included archery. It was an imperial examination for promotion, which included archery. It recognized that apart from the wen, or what Professor Ma described as the jing, the still, there was also a need for wu, military, or moving. And they adopted the Confucian principle of finding this centered position where archers would not exceed their authority, but would not also underperform. They used this concept to develop their military examination. The military examination existed in the Tang, and after it, also in the Sung dynasty. In the Yuan dynasty, which was dominated by the Mongolian people, it was suppressed. But in the Ming dynasty, 1368 to 1644, and the Qing dynasty, 1644 to 1911, it was firmly approved. However, the archery element in the military examination was actually abolished in 1902. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking in the context of this archery competition. Here's a photograph which was said to be in Guangzhou, Guangfu. And I believe the taller gentleman and the taller official on the left was actually the chief minister of that region, overseeing an archery competition. This is taken from a picture postcard, and it's just nice to have a photograph showing one of these competitions of the imperial examination. There are very, very few of them. Thanks to my friend Yevgeny Petrenko, who is in Ukraine now, dodging the bombs, but trying to write his MSc thesis, I have this nice illustration which tells you what the military examination in the Qing dynasty was like. It was in 3 sessions. The first was called Yichang, number 1, and it was horseback archery, which had to be held outside on a horseback archery track. There were 2 elements to it. One was called 射平靶, which was shooting parallel while galloping past the target. And the second was called 射地球, which was at full gallop, shooting at a ball filled with rice placed on the ground. So there were these 2 main elements. You had to score enough, you had to gallop your horse, and you would fail the examination if your hat fell off. The second, the Archang, had 3 elements. One was drawing a heavy bow. One was wielding a heavy halberd. And the third was raising a heavy stone. Those 3 were all simple tests of strength, bodily strength. But there was also archery on foot. Now, it looks as if on the picture that archery on foot is in Yichang. Actually, it was in Archang. And that was actually a competition to shoot at targets using a normal military strength bow. Provided anybody passed those 2 tests, they were allowed to take a simple written test on the military classics. The potential readers, then, of archery manuals in the Ming and Qing were nearly always students studying for these exams. Young men in China who could afford it were obsessed with taking the imperial exams. The most prestigious ones were for the civil side, and there was no test of military skills or martial arts. Those who couldn't hope to pass the civil exams would often try for the military exams. Being in military exams exempted people from certain national service duties. If a person had already passed the civil examination, they were not permitted to take the military examination. That was a brief survey of who were the main readers. Let me see who the writers are. Firstly, I need to explain that the idea of authorship in China traditionally is very different from the Western idea now. Confucius was famous for having said, 述而不作. I describe, I do not create. And as Confucius was regarded as the greatest moral figure, everyone who came after would not dare to say that they were 作而不述, that they were creating and not describing. Nearly every author so-called, actually put down that they were describing something older. So that you get these words, some of which mean create, like 住 and 做, but others just mean copying or revising old works, 传, 志, 定, 编辑, 述论. These are the words most commonly associated with these books. There were also people who wrote anonymously or with pseudonyms. There's a famous book called 冠诗新传 by somebody called Ji Jian. And this Ji Jian is probably a pseudonym. It's not a real name of somebody. Professor Ma Mingda, who did such a lot of research on Chinese archery books, could find no evidence of a real person called Ji Jian. The people who wrote the books were, of course, probably archery coaches, but they almost certainly would have been successful candidates in the examination, at least up to the middle grade, if not up to the highest grade of doctorate. Some works, but not very practical works, were also put together with literary scholars and enthusiasts called 好事者. So the contents then is nearly always closely associated with those words and concepts of Confucius. So there would also be reference to one of the early writers from the Tang dynasty called Wang Ju and his book called She Jing. There would be division in some books between foot archery and mounted archery. They would talk a lot about expression, 从容, stance, and the use of qi, 正极养气, determination to achieve the full draw, that is not in any sense only partially drawing the bow, which was called 智够. Then concentration on the bow hand, 持顾. Also sometimes some discussion of archery equipment, and in some books also something called the 相马经, which was a book about recognizing and looking after good horses. So the contents of these books would look at concepts like internal and external, because people followed a principle for archery. They were required. It was part of it was like the syllabus, that their external must be calm and internal must be fierce. There's a nice quotation from a Han Dynasty novel called 五岳春秋, the romance of Wu and Yue, two countries at war with each other, where there's a quotation from a so-called woman of Yue, and she says, when I use the pole for fighting, internally, I'm like a crouching tiger, snarling. Externally, I'm like a beautiful young woman smiling. It was this external appearance of calm and ability and confidence that was demanded in the examination and which was focused upon in the books. There was also some works which talked about crossbows, and here is an example. I hope that these slides will somehow be shared, but it shows how the division of this book, this is called 射艺精良, from the very, very beginning of the Qing dynasty. It shows how it divides the material. Communication of ideas. Of course, there were plain text explanations done in what we could call Guanhua, a sort of modernized classical Chinese. And then, particularly important were monochrome illustrations. If you look at the two illustrations here and this strange skeleton on the left, in the Chinese classics that an ordinary person might study, it was very rare to find specific identification of parts of the body, sufficient to actually give a detailed explanation. Then, if you look at different regions of China, the names of different parts of the body can be very different in dialect. So this author actually produced an image to identify all those joints and parts of the body that he was going to use in his book, as well as providing this useful illustration of how the bow hand should hold the bow. Then the mnemonic rhymes, the 歌诀, which was described just now as a vital element in some types of European text. It was also a vital element in some Chinese texts, but also as a parallel. Sometimes the mnemonic rhymes were so obscure that they needed further text to explain them. And some books then reproduced the books without the mnemonic rhymes at all, only just leaving the explanation. There would be questions and answers, 或问, and analysis of errors, 范并说. I'm supposed to point this at something. A quick word about loss of books, because when I read all the efforts that have been made, right up to Professor Ma Mingda, to identify archery books in China, we get the question of lost books. And I just want to say very quickly that there could be mistaken loss. That is, that the book has disappeared from China, but could still be found outside China. Sometimes these works are the whole original Chinese work in Chinese that have just been taken from China to, for example, to Japan, where they can now be found in the Toyobunko Library. But sometimes the Chinese books were translated into what we could call Sino-Japanese, Japanese written in Chinese kanji, completely, 100%, but with some help for your pronunciation, or Sino-Korean, which was the same idea, written in Hangul together with the Korean explanation. We find partial texts wrapped up in other works, even something like Huang Di Neijing, the Han Dynasty work on medicine, contains quotations derived from books on the crossbow. And as I just mentioned, this Wu Yue Chunqiu also contains very interesting technical detail about crossbow shooting, which has otherwise been lost. I have a copy of this book called 修锦社法指南车, which is the only surviving copy of a book by Liu Qi from the Qing dynasty. It was hidden inside a gazetteer of Tang dynasty Chang'an. For what reason, I don't know. But you would never have been able to find it if you were looking through library catalogues or lists of collections, because it was completely hidden. Finally, there are some valuable sources even in novels. There was a very famous novel called 镜花缘. I translated that as a chance encounter. It was about 10 young women, very talented, who passed the examinations, which is impossible for women, and then would go through a sort of adventure, a world tour. I'm going to overrun by 2 or 3 minutes. I hope that's all right. it's 5 minutes to 11. I just want to also finish with this thing, the situation of 每批 and personal notes written by previous book owners, because I myself have found valuable data hidden away. Well, not hidden away, it's there for all to see. For example, here is a very famous poem for archers, which was written in a novel on the left. The 社贵引断至征宽挡下期树雄 This poem in the style called 西江月 is very, very well known. But the owner of the book felt that it had been misquoted, that it was wrong. And at the top, he wrote down the way he thought it should have been quoted, so that although many archers and some books knew and learnt this mnemonic off by heart, this owner is saying, that was wrong. We need to revise this to this, okay? So that instead of a rather confusing sentence about your feet weighing 1,000 katis, you stand with the weight on your back foot, he says. And then he says at the last line, the application of your body force needs to be even so that you will hit the target. So that is his amended version. So this is another small source for these archery books. The books that have survived are very important points of technique specific to the Asian composite bow, just like, as we have had explained, the early books are important sources for the revival of some of the Western martial arts. But particularly, they give us an insight into the syllabus and scoring criteria of the Ming and Qing imperial military examinations. It's interesting that you can read many works which explain the procedures of the Ming and Qing 武科举 without actually explaining what the marking criteria were. But these books help you understand what they were. The books provide insights into pre-modern Chinese ideas on psychology and stress management for the exams, which I have also applied to my students, even university students. They give us an appreciation of Ming and Qing aesthetics in publishing and to approaches in sports coaching. That is the end of my presentation. I don't know whether there were supposed to be questions. If there's time for them, I'm happy to take them. If there's no time, then on to the next. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Shelby. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation and also thank you for the introduction. So, as mentioned earlier, I'm currently a principal investigator of a research project funded by the German Research Foundation, which is focusing on the emergence of martial arts texts in the late Middle Ages. In the course of my research, I came across a unique and rather curious piece of evidence. While the concept of martial arts lineage is today most often associated with Asian martial arts styles, the 15th century fencing master Paulus Karl included an elaborate lineage of masters in all of his surviving martial arts treatises. In this lineage, a certain master, Johannes Lichtenauer, is presented as the founder of a society of masters, and Paulus Karl lists 16 masters in this lineage, placing himself, sorry, how can I get back? Okay, there he is. Placing himself at the end of this list as a direct disciple of the allegedly most important first-generation master student named Stettner. The aim of my talk is to contextualize this piece of evidence in relation to European martial arts culture of the late Middle Ages. To achieve this, I will structure my presentation as follows. I will start with an introduction, but I will skip many details about fighting books, as my friend Daniel has already covered this topic in his keynote. I will then talk about the content of German fight books and approach these unique sources from the perspective of cultural history and the history of knowledge. In another section, I will present two 15th century fencing masters and fight book authors, the already mentioned Paulus Karl and his potential rival Hans Talhofer, and compare their strategies of self-fashioning as martial arts experts in a highly competitive martial culture. And finally, I will summarize and draw a brief conclusion. This slide is intended to give you a visual impression of the different types of fight books. First of all, we're dealing with a very heterogeneous corpus of texts. The earliest sample can be dated to the beginning of the 14th century, and currently we know about roughly 109 manuscripts and manuscript fragments, and about 78 printed works that have survived from the 14th century to the beginning of the 17th century. The range of languages includes Latin, German, Italian, French, Spanish, English, Dutch, and Portuguese. Within this corpus of European fight books, treatises written in German or Latin with German fencing terminology represent the earliest samples of a highly detailed martial arts treatises in a European context. Their emergence and the surrounding cultural and social aspects are therefore the focus of my current research project. "108 manuscripts and 78 prints is not an extremely large number of surviving sources, but it is a significant number. Late medieval Europe saw a rise in literacy and pragmatic writing during the 14th century and especially from the beginning of the 15th century onwards. However, there are many subjects about which we know very little and where we lack such rich sources as the fight books. So when I approach the fight books from a historical perspective, I often think of the old tip of the iceberg metaphor. The fact that such a significant number of elaborate records of martial arts techniques have survived means that the martial arts of medieval Europe must have been a very important cultural factor. And by studying the fight books, we can only begin to understand the significance and social impact of this martial culture. I will now turn to Johannes Lichtenauer, the master who is acknowledged as a grandmaster in the lineage of Paulus Karl. So far, we have no biographical data about this master, and he is only known as the authority behind 3 related fighting systems. These are fighting with a two-handed sword without armor, fighting on foot in full armor, and fighting on horseback in full armor. The earliest source also records his teachings on unarmed combat, but this text is not found in any other source and it's not canonized. Master Lichtenauer's teachings are composed of mnemonic verses designed to structure each lesson. The use of these verses must have been similar to the use of forms or taolu by Asian masters. They serve to organize, transmit, and remember the embodied knowledge of his specific style. The verses list specific techniques and relate them to each other, but they do not give information on how to perform these techniques or for which situation they are suitable. In this way, the verses also protect Lichtenauer's art, because only initiates could understand of his system could understand their true meaning. The first mention of Lichtenauer's martial art is recorded in a personal notebook from the end of the 14th century or the beginning of the 15th century. What is remarkable about this notebook is that the author may have been a student of Master Lichtenauer himself. He records Lichtenauer's teachings and adds his own comments, explaining the arcane verses and giving clear descriptions of techniques and contexts of application. The second oldest example, from the 1420s, is also a rather curious piece of evidence. As the text of Lichtenauer's verses has found its way into a collection of quite different texts bound together in a German monastery. Particularly interesting is the fact that the verses are not associated with the Grand Master himself, but are marked as the teachings of a certain Master Berengois. This could mean that there were already other masters, legitimate students or not, who spread the Lichtenauer system through their own teachings. The existence of at least one generation of students who built on Lichtenauer's teachings is proven beyond doubt by a manuscript dated 1452. In which the deceased master is depicted as a fully established authority, sitting on a throne, equipped with a blunt practice sword and a staff. In this manuscript, we find several commentaries on the master's verses alongside each other, so that we can clearly see the formation of a martial arts style in which the commentaries of the first generation of disciples became established teachings and are recorded alongside the textual legacy of the master. Looking at a selection of texts associated with or strongly influenced by Lichtenauer's system, we can see that his style was dominant in the German-speaking world for almost 200 years, and that it was disseminated in both manuscript and print. So, who were those masters who taught Lichtenauer's style? I will introduce two of them at the end of this talk, but first we need to take a closer look at the daily interactions of these men. This is a document from 1437 that was used to settle a violent dispute between two fencing masters in Landshut. Some of these masters traveled around the empire, teaching those who could afford their services in larger towns. But if the city authorities had granted a master the right to teach fencing in public, then the so-called law of the sword allowed other fencing masters to challenge him to a formal duel. This happened in 1437 to Jörg Helfenstein, who was challenged by Hans Kreuzberg and had to fight him in a duel with sharp swords and no armor in front of the elder men as judges. The fight did not end in the death of either combatant, but Helfenstein broke the rules and wounded his opponent after the judges had already intervened. He was banned from the city for 6 months and lost the prize money for the fight, as well as his right to teach in Landshut. We can see then that these professional or semi-professional martial arts instructors were engaged in a highly competitive trade that could lead to a formal duel, as also attested by the works of the Italian master Fiore de Liberi. The mention of prize money in the Landshut Charter also points to the commercial aspects of medieval martial arts. Within the Holy Roman Empire, fencing masters were among the first professional groups to be granted an imperial privilege, which gave them far-reaching rights. Due to the itinerant nature of their craft, they did not form a local guild, but a fraternity of masters called the Brotherhood of St. Mark. In 1487, Emperor Frederick III granted them the sole right to promote fencing in the empire and to examine candidates who wished to teach fencing. Candidates had to complete a period of apprenticeship, pay a substantial fee to the Brotherhood, and demonstrate their skills in a public demonstration. So in the next section, I will turn to the actual content of the fight books in the Lichtenauer tradition. But first, I would like to briefly outline how I conceptualize martial arts knowledge from my point of view as a cultural historian. I approach martial arts as a cultural phenomenon and above all as social institutions. These institutions are organized around fighting as a social practice and a mode of kinetic interaction between human bodies. Martial arts styles are thus ways of curating embodied knowledge and embodied techniques related to fighting practices. When it comes to conceptualizing this embodied knowledge, I draw on a concept coined by the French sociologist Marcel Mauss, which he called techniques of the body. It is currently being reworked by my colleague Bernd Spatz, who defines it as follows, I quote, "Technique differs from related concepts like performativity and habitus in that it emphasizes the epistemic dimension of practice. Embodied technique then refers to transmissible and repeatable knowledge of relatively reliable possibilities afforded by human embodiment." End quote. I know this is a rather abstract way of thinking about martial arts knowledge, but it is precisely this level of abstraction that allows far-reaching comparisons to be made along the axis of time and space. Focusing on technique as a form of transmissible knowledge allows us to look at structural similarities between different martial arts styles in global, transcultural, and above all, transtemporal perspectives. This abstract perspective also allows us to ask fundamental questions, such as, if martial arts are indeed a way of preserving and curating embodied knowledge and technique, what is the cultural significance of writing books about techniques that can only be fully understood in practice through embodiment? And how did medieval masters nevertheless attempt to codify their knowledge using the most elaborate, time-stable medieval media available to them, namely texts and images? In the case of Johannes Lichtenau, we can see that the most important aspect was to establish a specific technical lexis that could serve as a kind of shorthand for notating movement. In this example, you can see the master's mnemonic verses in which he mentions the 5 master strikes and then begins to treat the wrath strike. Our anonymous student of the system then comments on these verses to explain that the wrath strike is actually just a strike coming directly from the right shoulder. He also informs us that Lichtenauer calls this the wrath strike because it comes naturally and is usually the first choice of a person who is very angry with you. Although we have fairly conclusive descriptions of the respective technical terms, it is not an easy task to interpret them as a modern historian and a martial artist. But my time is limited, as I see. So if you're interested in embodied research and reconstruction, I've published my initial thoughts in Daniel Jacquet's open access journal, Acta Periodica Duellatorum. However, although the definition of technical terms is key to the Lichtenauer tradition, we can also find other strategies for codifying embodied knowledge, for codifying knowledge of technique within the fightbook corpus. I have already mentioned most of them, such as the technical lexis, the prose descriptions, and Lichtenauer's mnemonic verses, as well as the glosses commenting on the enigmatic verses. But we can also find illustrations of important movements in the execution of a single technique, as well as some serial illustrations showing successive phases of movement. Finally, there are also a few diagrams showing the angles of certain cuts or geometric patterns related to the position of limbs and weapons. Could you go back one slide, please? Thanks. Another aspect that seems relevant to me is the level of abstraction with which fight books treat fighting as a mode of kinetic interaction. There are those who mainly collect useful techniques grouped by weapon or fighting discipline. Sometimes these techniques are logically linked as technique, counter-technique, and counter-to-counter technique. But however, the underlying system remains rather implicit in these writings, and they can be characterized as something like a phrase book that collects only ideal-type solutions to ideal-type threats. However, the texts... Could you go one back? Chase. However, the texts in the tradition of Master Lichtenauer are structured differently, and I think this may partly explain their popularity for almost 200 years. Lichtenauer's system can be characterized by its high level of abstraction, as the techniques are not only grouped into specific interrelated categories, but are also linked by the use of abstract concepts to address the fundamentals of martial arts training. Lichtenauer calls these the 5 words. These are 2 pairs of opposites, before and after, and strength and weakness, linked by the word indes, which means simultaneously, and is closely related to the action of feeling your opponent's vector through your own blade. This observation does not fully apply to all of the teachings associated with the Grandmaster, as the longsword is treated most eloquently, while armored fighting on foot and on horseback is much less interwoven with abstract fighting theory. We can also see that some authors of fight books, especially Lichtenauer's first commentator, who must have been a scholar, are more interested in theory than others. I will now turn to 2 very brief case studies of 15th century masters who left us their treatises. I've chosen Hans Talhofer and Paulus Kahl because both of their teachings are directly linked to the Lichtenauer lineage. But while Paul Kahl chose to integrate the aforementioned martial arts lineage into all of his manuscripts, his colleague and perhaps direct rival, Hans Talhofer, chose to subsequently erase all ties to the Lichtenauer tradition. Hans Talhofer is first recorded in the 1430s as a man-at-arms for the imperial city of Nuremberg, and later held a minor office as a tax collector. He produced several superbly illustrated manuscripts for noblemen who must have been his clients. One of Hans Talhofer's specialties was the preparation of his clients for the potential judicial duels, but such duels were the exception in the 15th century. Nevertheless, noblemen valued the martial knowledge of how to fight such a duel, as the defense of their rights and honor in single combat was closely linked to their cultural identity. Unlike Talhofer, who seems to have trained several noble lords during his career, Paulus Kahl had close ties to one particular lord, whom he served for many years. Appointed in 1450 by the Duke of Bavaria, who resided in Landshut, he served him as in various capacities, from toll collector to full member of the court. After his lord's death, he changed courts and served another high-ranking nobleman, the Archduke of Austria, as his personal fencing master. Fortunately, we even know where Paulus Kahl lived in Landshut. He's recorded as having lived in a wealthy and respectable neighborhood close to the ducal palace, as you can see from this wooden model from the 16th century. The house is still intact, and I was able to have a look at it the last time I was in Landshut. As a ducal residence, Landshut must also have been a center of martial arts culture. Remember that the duel between the 2 fencing masters mentioned earlier took place in front of the town's hall. And among our 109 manuscripts and 78 printed books, those written by Paulus Kahl are the only ones in which we can find a lineage of masters that legitimizes the author as a second-generation master directly linked to Grandmaster Lichtenauer. Why is this so? I will try to answer this question in my conclusion. As a historian, I was suspicious of the lineage claims made by Paulus Kahl. Since Kahl's teachings consist only of image catalogues and contain almost no text, sorry, this is an old slide, I forgot to, no, you can go further. No, further. Just click until the picture is complete. I had to compare the images with the technical descriptions in the Lichtenauer tradition. And although I expected discrepancies, I found the exact opposite. It thus seems that one of Paulus Karl's main achievements was to translate the textual commentary tradition into didactic images. And although he reorganized the content of Lichtenauer's teachings, Karl's 5 books show a large overlap with the teachings of the Grand Masters and the second generation of students. I would therefore conclude that the claim of a direct lineage is highly probable. Unlike Talhofer, Karl presents himself as the legitimate descendant of one of the most popular martial arts teachers of the late 14th or early 15th century, which he may have well been. Talhofer, however, broke away from this tradition and emancipated himself by composing his own didactic verses and presenting himself as a very self-confident martial arts teacher. As can be seen in this illustration from a manuscript dated 1459, Talhofer wears a necklace depicting a winged lion with a sword. This could indicate that he was directly involved in the founding of the aforementioned Brotherhood of St. Mark, which received its imperial privilege in 1487, and thus gained a monopoly on the promotion of fencing masters within the Holy Roman Empire. To briefly summarize, the 5 books point to a period in European history that can be characterized by the rise of influential cities that fostered a dense urban culture, an increase in literacy and pragmatic writing, and the growing importance of crafts and guilds. At the same time, we can see a fully developed martial arts culture with a high level of competition in which professional or semi-professional and resident as well as traveling fencing masters competed for paying students and lucrative positions at court. We also have evidence of a very early process of institutionalization in the realm of the Holy Roman Empire, culminating in the imperial privilege of 1487. Within this larger historical context, the 5 books point to a community of practitioners and masters organized around the 14th century teachings of Master Johannes Lichtenauer. Talhofer and Karl are both part of this martial arts culture, in which both association with the teachings of Johannes Lichtenauer and the use of books are seen as markers of competence. Karl's use of a martial arts lineage to document his claim as a direct descendant of a Grandmaster Lichtenauer thus represents a specific and viable strategy of self-fashioning in a highly competitive 15th century martial arts environment. Thank you very much.
我们知道历史上福建是我们南派武术的一个发展中心，特别是明清以来一直引导着我们南方武术的发展。到现在长江以南的武术，我们一般来说都叫它南少林，南派的少林拳。在明代嘉靖到万历年间，福建浙江两省都是成为我们抗欧的主要战场。长年的抗欧战争促进了当地的武术发展，福建武术的大幅提升，军旅和民间传统武术出现了一次历史性的大融合。抗欧的名将戚继光的绩效新书《一带一路的战经》，在我们传统的武术基础上进行了比较系统性的改良，形成了一个完整的武术体系。经过400多年的传承，到现在仍然存留在福建的泉州、江州和闽南的一带。明末清初满人入关，福建成为了反清复明的最后基地，大量的明朝渔民涌入了福建，再次的把中原武术文化带进了福建。主要的变化就是民间武术取代了军旅的武术。明代浙江的武术最发达的地方，大量的武术著作和当时社会的现实需要，民间武术的传播和发展发现了最规律性的 大的变化。到现在已经有380多年历史的福建永春百叶钱，就是在当时大环境下产生了。清朝康熙年代，明朝的渔民浙江丽水的少林拳师封总，带他的女儿迁居到福建的霞浦。方其良在他父亲教的少林拳基础上，施受浙江内家拳以柔克刚、以静制动的心法，采取了白河的各种生活动态，创作了象形曲意、使柔非柔、使刚实刚的合法，也就是现在我们俗称的白河拳。和拳的出现，改变了福建传统武术的原生态。随着福建反清复明的各种活动，郑成功的军队、民间的复清复明的反清复明主题的天地会，合法顺理成章地传入了台湾地区。后来，方其良跟她丈夫曾氏从霞浦移民到闽南的永春，在永春发扬了合法。从康熙到乾隆年间，合法在技法和理论上形成了具有永春人文地理特点的图书体系，加上早期出来传教永春拳的都是永春人，他们一般在闽南、福建地区就俗称这种合法叫永春拜和拳。到清乾隆嘉靖年间，永春拜和拳第3代的传人把他们一生传入了新式结晶写成了书，到现在有萧博士的桃园全书、邓桥的白河切要条文、林董的白河拳家正法，还有2个没有署名的方其良拳主、白河先师主的真法、永春正理书教传拳法，节节古朴。有永春白河拳师苏云安先生无事公开，现在有康义先生的语文文化出版社发行了。那我们大家都可以一看清朝那个时候的合法的内容。清朝道光咸丰年间，大批的永春白拳师出外教拳，把永春白拳回传到福建、浙江、福州、浙江、江西等地区。那个时候开始引发出各种风格不同的飞鸣、寿司众等流派的和拳。这些和拳到现在还在沿用我们先辈传下来的古拳谱。福州、泉州历史上就是我国对外海上贸易的主要港口。到现在，日本琉球的武术也受到我们福建武术的影响。在明朝洪武年间，门人36姓依据了刘清老爸，将我们福建的武术带入流行。19世纪，从福州地区传到琉球的武笔记，比日本空手道他们看作是信经秘诀。实际上，那个武笔记我们看起来也就是一本纯粹的福建白叶拳的专书，里面内容就现在我们福州人明和拳差不多一样。所以公罗的空手道，他们以书上拳法大摇拔句、发刚柔吞吐、取刚柔2个字为他们流派的名。上个世纪初，他的创办人东安拉宽亮和2代主公孙长信先生曾经到福州学了白鹤拳，把3战跟转掌看作一刚一柔的经典套路。永春白鹤拳从清朝嘉庆年间遗留下来了很多拳谱，他们对3战都有比较详细记录。乾隆年间，第5代传人林董在他白河家正法说：要学识3战，自真自威， 动静来去，国卫处理技巧，当从陈身助气及推教，发人心弦，气助如力，起势不发，地居度外，欲要作所妙法，其之怪，不求其根本，图求之末，无知之何也？何事先就其真本，虚先相矣，必无台呀。他们讲的就是我们先辈对那个三战拳的重视。事实上，三战呢是白拳重要的练功方法，在和拳的理论的计划的基础上呢，我们这么多年有点体会。说起来，三战看起来很简单，三进三退。也没有什么比较大的动作，但是它的动作要求规范，锻炼筋骨，手脚相应，还有其他很多吞吐浮琴啊、高度协调的一些要求。现在告诉我们学什么，也就是头、心、手、脚4种力士，这是三战基本功法的道理。但是三战欲学难精。我们师门有时候有句话说：入门战、出门战，14人就练三战。那下面呢，对于一些古前部的要求，我就不练了。过来，再下来。好了。在我们的经验，练三战，我们的四门教下来就分3个阶段，我把它分成刚、脆、柔3种。事实上，三战的要求的目的就是练那个频率高、速度快、穿透力、爆发力强的一种力量，也就是我们福建话说的，福建白话拳说的寸劲接力，也就是我们闽南话说准力、准心。有人叫准，有人叫丢，咱了叫准心合法。要求大家差不多一样了，但是每一个系统的三战都有不同的要求，不同的练法。现在我就让我的学生罗俊杰示范一下我们要求的刚、脆、柔。那个文字上我就不再练了，大家有机会自己看就可以了，好吧？邊個先？打公先啊？脆、柔3個。你打你是打兩套啦。打柔先。打柔先。打頭同尾啦。頭同柔啦。公同柔啦。即公同柔。他表演一下我們四門的三戰的剛，就用力的把那個力量逼出來。他的动作慢慢，力量由身体里面逼出来了。练的时候配合呼吸。双脚膝举抓地， 就是我们市民的所谓的刚用力了，表面上看起来就僵硬的，我们称刚，然后练了一个时期，就要把练到的力量把它释放出来，甩出去，通过关节肌肉把那个力量放开，得不得？吹啊，慢慢。就我们所说的吹是咱闽南话啦，咱闽南话讲较切，将迄力弹出去啊。还有就是揉，算了，辛苦。基本上我们要求这样，谢谢大家。
阿兄弟叫我打人，
佢唔掂喎。
OK，我打。
再示范一下揉的，刚才比较辛苦啊。让人家提问题，让观众是吧？可以 ，OK。謝謝大家。佢俾人哋問下有咩嘢？你問啦。唔使話，我唔使㗎。你說。
如果现场有任何的问题，都可以问李刚师傅这边。If there are any questions in the audience, Master Lee is happy to take any questions. Are there any?
有咩啊佢？
刻画的3个那个形式，刚、柔、脆。打柔的时候，我看他的演绎呢，跟李刚老师您的演绎不太一样，是不是每一个人的打柔的手姿？
佢話打剛柔脆 ，OK， 咁啊我打嘅形式同你嘅形式有啲唔一樣，咁係咪每個人？打剛阿慶華問打剛柔脆有3個形式，咁打柔嘅方面係咪每個人都唔一樣？
我们的要求就是把练柔，就是把我们之前学到了硬跟脆 再重新组合，通过我们的意识、我们的思维，把力量集中，怎么发挥出来，达到最好的效果，就是我们说的抖，寸进距离，近距离发出的力量有穿透跟爆发力，达到我们自己的要求。
Thank you. Thank you, Master Wu.
这样啊。
Greetings to all. I am Marco Ferrari. As I was presented before, I am an instructor at the Italian Fencing Federation Garetings Research Center in Botticino, Brescia, and I'm an Italian rapier instructor at Guardia di Croce Fencing Club, Opera Nova. As most of you might know, the rapier is the 17th century Western civilian dueling sword. It's that kind of sword. I want to thank my friend Hing for inviting me to attend to this conference. I am very honored and proud to be here, so thank you again. Well, starting with my lecture, when I saw the proposed topic for the conference lectures, I thought I could bring my experience, especially regarding one of them, the cross-cultural influences between different fencing systems. As a researcher of Northern Italian fencing, I think I'm one of the right person to talk about this topic. Indeed, 17th century Northern Italy is a perfect example of how cultural contamination can create a functioning fencing system and bring innovation. And this kind of contamination always takes place on several levels, at least two levels, a cultural level and a street level, as we can say. The first level, the cultural one, is that of the masters, reading each other's treatises and drawing lessons, concept, technique, and languages from them. The second is that of the fencers who confront each other in the street, who dueled in the streets of the European cities, each fighting in their own national style. The duel is when someone became the stranger sword of the other, and the stranger sword is something that you have to face, something you have to understand, and is something that you have to beat. I must therefore make two preliminary remarks before embarking in the discussion. The first premise concerns the fact that in the 17th century Europe, there were three main fencing systems: the Italian, the Spanish, and the French. The Italian system is at the time was strongly rooted in its treatise tradition and goes back to the Middle Ages. In the 16th century, Italy was a sort of fulcrum, a sort of center of spreading of martial culture in Europe. And a lot of treatises from Italian authors were translated in other languages, in French, in German. So Italy had a great tradition of martial culture and the treatise production. The second great culture of 17th century is the Spanish one. The Spanish system, the so-called verdadera destreza, that's the name of this system, was established as an organized and structured system in the 17th century. In Spain, the masters were authorized to teach by the king's law. They created a system in its own that has very particular elements, a very high stance, elegant movement, a circular movement around the opponent, and a very well-refined culture of work on the blade of the opponent. Finally, the French one was another system, was another of the three great European systems of 17th century. In the second half of the 17th century, France began to produce its first major treatises. As some of you might know, the French school will flourish in the next century, in the 18th century. The second premise is that Northern Italy at the time was not part of a cohesive nation, but divided into small states with different influences, indigenous and foreign. And this political fragmentation and the coexistence of fencers from different national systems turned Northern Italy into a testing ground for mutual exchange of fencing solution. So in this case, we are speaking of cross-cultural influences, Northern Italy was the correct place to do this kind of experiment. To prove this thesis, I will use several sources, printed treatises, and free manuscript. The first manuscript is the one of Giovan Battista Cristiani, which from Pavia. This manuscript is kept in the Tribulziana Library of Milan. It dates more or less 1679, 1681, and the other two manuscripts are the one of Giovan Battista Solza, which is kept in the Brescia Museum of Martial Art, and the one of Master Carlo Dati, which dates more or less in the middle of the 18th century, so it's quite later respect to the other. And then, of course, I will use also as reference the printed treatises, as you can see here, as the one of Alessandro Senese, 1660 from Bologna, always an Italian author from the north. Giovanni Pietro Gorio, 1682, from Milan. And other treatises that I will use is the one of Bondi di Mazzo from Venice, always author from the northern part of Italy. If we take a bird's eye view of the 17th century Italy, we see, in a fencing point of view, of course, if we can see the fencing panorama of 17th century Italy, we see that the southern Italy is characterized by a unique presence of a strong school, which is called the Roman Neapolitan school. This school is strongly identitarian and acts as a kind of protection against external influences. On the other hand, in northern Italy, the lack of a stylistic authority and the political fragmentation worked in an opposite direction, making the ground very permeable to foreign inputs. For example, the style of the northern Italian fencer is so rich in foreign elements that a Neapolitan author, an author from the south, which is called the Duke Giuseppe d'Alessandro, will later say that half of the Italian fencers of this time fenced like the French, and the other fenced like Neapolitan. when he speaks about Italians that fence like the French, that fight like French, he is referring to the authors and the fencers of northern Italy. So he sees them as a stranger, not as Italians. In the same way, the Spanish and the French master of the time tend to identify the Italian fencer with the Roman Neapolitan one, and not with the northern one, precisely because there were too many foreign elements in the fencing of the northerners. Here you see some images, and this is the one on the left is an image of a Spanish treatise which show the way of fighting of an Italian, and his particular trust. This Italian that is depicted here is an Italian from the south. And also you see this frontispiece comes from one treatise from the southern Italian authors, and it depicts the dynasty of masters that founded there a school. In fact, the treatises and manuscript written by the northern authors reflect all the richness of a transnational dialogue. There is a dialogue in their fencing. It's an open fencing, open to influences, and it's full of elements from other systems. So this is my main goal of this lecture, to show how rich could be a system if it takes element from other systems. From a stylistic point of view, I will speak about three types of influence on the Italian martial cultures. The first one is stylistic, the second one is cultural, and the third one is instrumental. From a stylistic point of view, these northern authors, such as Giovan Battista Cristiani, who writes his treatise, his manuscript, did not confine themselves only to analyzing the strength and the weakness of the French and the Spanish combat position and so on, but borrowed several elements. These elements then became structural in their system. Even the style of other masters, such as the Milanese Gorio, seems to have been influenced by continental thinking. There is a French influence in his fighting style, and the master also draws on some Spanish technical elements, such as wide circular movement around the opponent, and so on. Another master analyzes the difference between fighting position and footwork of the Italians, of the French and the Spanish. And this is not just a scientific or cultural interest, but is obviously based on observation made on the field, on the sword field. Some of these masters, when they write about the foreign fighters, they tell, I saw them fighting, I saw their students. So there is a strict and daily contact between those fighters and those masters. And for example, on the other hand, here you can see an example. On the other hand, we can see in the treatise of Bonde di Mazzo, we see, which is an author from Venice, we see elements of French fencing. For example, here on the left part, you can see the thrust. The Italian stoccata. The stoccata is a thrust made with a lunge. Okay, you see on the left part the thrust made by the Italian authors of the south. You see that the torso is in a right position, is an upright position. On the right side, you see in the upper corner, you see the thrust made by an author from northern Italy, and under this picture, you can see the thrust made by a French author. As you can see here, the torso is in a diagonal position, and you see that the torso is pushed onward, and this is a French characteristics that is very this is the same. in the northern Italian authors. So only to evidence the fact that they borrowed a lot of elements, and also structural and very important elements, such as the morphology of the lange, of the botta, of the stoccata. A foreigner, from a schemistic point of view, is always a problem to be solved. And this forced the local masters to work against measures, innovation, imitation, and unexpected elements. During this period, in the 17th century, many Spanish masters were concerned with analyzing foreign fighters and how to deal with them. The French master Liancourt, you can see the picture in the lower corner is from his treatise. But here you can see better. The master Liancourt devotes a large part, 3 long chapters of his treatise to stylistic analysis and answer to counter Italian, Spanish, and German fencers. And in his treatise, he shows an Italian guard. Here you can see the picture of the Italian guard of his time, and this Italian guard is the same depicted and described by the Italian authors of the North. The Italian, of course, Liancourt speaks about the way of fighting different martial cultures, not only the Italians, but also the Spanish and the German fencers. The Italian master, Carlo Dati, it's one of the authors of the 3 manuscripts I quoted before. He writes more or less in the middle of the 18th century, so very later. Carlo Dati presents 4 fighting positions in his system. And one of these 4 guards or fighting position is of French inspiration, and another is of Spanish inspiration. So he describes 4 guards, and 2 are borrowed by abroad. So this is a clear sign that foreign styles were now integral part of Northern Italian system. The foreign influence on Northern Italian authors is not limited to a technical level, but can also be seen on a cultural level. Several masters, including the Milanese Giovanni Pietro Gorio, are captivated by the figure of master of arms as a man of sword and letters. And this was a Spanish idea. In Spain, the master was not only a man of steel, a man of sword, was only a man of pen, a man of culture. And this idea of the master as a knight, as an intellectual, captivated also the Italian authors. And so Giovanni Pietro Gorio devoted a large part of his treatise to speak about the master as a man of culture, as in the Spanish idea, as in the Spanish image of the master. So this was a cultural element that was borrowed by abroad. And the Northern Italian authors also had a clear sense of belonging to an European fighting class. If you think about it, there is a master, Alessandro Senese. Here you can see the frontispiece of his treatise on the right part. Alessandro Senese decided to summarize his treatise and translate the most important part of his treatise into Latin. Because at that time, Latin was the language of the European cultural elite, such as, or an international language such as the English now. So Senese knew that his work in that way would have had an international reach, an international spreading. And finally, to conclude my lecture, from an instrumental point of view, the fencing instruments, it's possible to observe some contamination in northern Italy. For example, the northern part of the peninsula in the 17th century was the first part of Italy to adopt the new sword of French origin, the small sword. It's interesting to note that in the southern Italy, on the other hand, the use of the long rapier of the 17th century will continue until the middle of the 18th century. So where there is no dialogue, no contamination, innovation is slower, also in the fencing world. For example, Gorio treatise and Solza manuscript are the first Italian treatises to develop system based on the use of the small sword. Here you can see some pictures. On the right side, the treatise of French master de la Touche, 1670, which shows the use of the small sword. On the left side, you can see in the upper part, this is an illustration from a treatise from the southern Italy, which shows one fencer on the right part, which is a Neapolitan fencer, so a southern fencer that is using steel rapier. On the left part, there is another fencer, probably a northern Italian fencer, because he make a different stoccata, which is more similar to the one of the north, and he is using a dual sword, more lighter and shorter, and with a disc-like hilt. And this is probably the refiguration of the depiction of a northern Italian fencer. So these weapons were spreading in the second half of the 17th century in Italy, in the northern part of the peninsula. And one of these weapons is also depicted in the treatise of the Ferrarese master, Marin Bresciani. Ferrara is another city from northern Italy. Here you see a French influence, not only in the type of the sword that he is using, but also in the fashion of the clothes and the illustration. In conclusion, I can tell that the example of northern Italy in the second half of the 17th century show how an environment open and receptive to outside influences can produce new and highly versatile fencing systems. Such schemistic systems not only allow the system itself to progress, but are a source of inspiration and growth to the outside world, because also the other culture who contribute to this dialogue take fruitful element, and this bring benefits to the art as a whole. I want to last thank you for your time and attention. The work I've briefly presented here is a part of a longer and more complex scientific article. I am happy to make it available to anyone who is interested from you. And I will now be glad if you want to answer to any question you may have. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Ferrari.
Hi, how are you, my friend? Thank you.
Very well, thank you.
Thank you for an absolutely inspiring and insightful presentation, which has really opened my eyes to the interaction of Northern Italy with other so-called national systems. Now, you have spoken extensively of how other systems, particularly the Spanish and French, have cross-fertilized with Northern Italy. But in my observation, Italy being an early center of European martial arts and fencing in particular, is also a source of creativity and cultural change. Taking the example of Camilla Agrippa in particular, the scientific method pioneered by Agrippa using geometry and using perspectives, that had a major influence on the notation, on the illustration and perception and teaching of fencing elsewhere in Europe. Is that the case?
Yeah, is that the case? In the 16th century, Camillo Agrippa is an author, as you correctly remark. It's an author from the previous century. And in the previous century, as was in my premise, Italy was, of course, the spreading point of martial culture. And Italian authors they influenced very deeply all the other cultures. I have a practical example of this. For example, I didn't speak about the German fencing of the 17th century. There is a reason, because the German fencing of the 17th century was still strongly and so strongly influenced by Italian authors. I give you an example. There is an Italian author which is called Salvatore Fabris. He wrote his treatise at the very end of the 16th century. His treatise was translated in German, and a lot of German masters read his treatise and take innovation and solution from him. At the very end of the 17th century, there is a French author called Liancourt. He shows how the German fight. We are at the very end of the 17th century, so a century after the treatise of Salvatore Fabris. He shows the German Guard, and the German Guard is the same of Salvatore Fabris. So the German authors take all from him, and in a century of development of martial art, they still use a guard that is similar to the Salvatore Fabris guard and other elements that are similar to this author. So this is something that shows how deep and rooted was the influence of Italian authors on the other martial cultures. But in the 17th century, also the other martial cultures were creating their systems. And these systems influenced the Italian one, but were, of course, influenced by the Italian one.
Thank you very much, Marco. I'll pass the mic back to the Master of Ceremony, but before doing so, I just want to say, please don't give your paper to anyone, because we need to publish it. Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you, Mr. Ferrari.
Thank you. Can I make 3 thanks before leaving?
Yes.
I want to thank, first of all, Roberto Gotti, which opened his collection to me. He gave me a lot of material, and all the treatises that I have analyzed comes from his collection. He's a man that loves fencing, and he's precious for that. I want to thank also, of course, my friend Hing for having invited me here. And I want to thank Francesca Romana, who is my girlfriend. She helped me to prepare my speech. And I want to thank Alberto Marzona, which is one of my students that helped me to translate my work. I hope to see you all soon. And if some of you want material and my article, it's free for you. I will send it to you.
Thank you, Mr. Ferrari.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you again, and bye.
Thank you. See you.